Airplane Aplomb. Almost everybody has harrowing airplane stories. I'm not completely sure why that is. Mainly, perhaps, because the stakes are always so high, so potentially obliterative, if you will. But these stories are almost always in the near miss category. That is, nothing big actually happens. Of course, that's due to, if it wasn't a miss, then there's no one to tell the story. In any case, airplane stories are extremely common, yet the serious occurrences are extremely rare. If a plane falls on a guy's house, the guy is almost always out playing golf at the time anyway. And if you yourself are in the plane that almost falls on a guy's house, well, the sixth attempt to reignite the engines usually works, and the plane just keeps on winging. That's not to say that there aren't some truly awful accidents involving death and horrific suffering, and those must be respected. But at the same time, we all seem to have not just empathy at the ready, but actual laughter when hearing of almost airplane stories. The additional feature which we explore here is the almost cartoonish calm with which such stories are often issued and received as they unfold in real life. I have come to call this phenomenon airplane aplomb. Aplomb, according to Webster's Third Unabridged, the word means nonchalance, confidence, coolness, poise. Other sources might just call it denial. Take, for example, the time our Gulf Trip 737 set down on Rock Island en route to Eleuthera. Did the small bushes erupting from the cracks in the runway deter our salutary outlook? What about the shirtless guy who exited the outhouse-sized remnant of a terminal building, waving his arms in that desperate palms forward alternating X sign goalpost shape, indicating in no uncertain terms that if it ever was, this was no longer an operating commercial landing strip? Did that guy deter us from enjoying life, from continuing on our golf trip? Why not just do a one-wheel locked high-speed 180-degree pivot and head back down the runway, bushes slapping the fuselage, and relaunch her back over the scrub palmetto? Why not take the remaining 5 miles to the real non-abandoned airstrip at a below radar 500 feet and land there? Why mention or explain to anyone? That's what I'm calling aplomb. Had there been, say, a rusted old fuel truck parked on that runway, well, then there would be no story and no aplomb. So, what we do is relate the stories with humor and nonchalance if we can. As if every routine flight was at base as risky as a trip to the moon. But you really know you're going to get there in good order as long as you keep your aplomb. So, what about my friend Quimby that time we were departing the Montreal airport in his rented Cessna? Quimby, who was well into his pilot licensing procedure and could rent planes and go wherever, maybe not at night or into sleet or enemy ack-ack, I have no idea. I knew we didn't need that then. But what we did need was tower clearance for takeoff after a night of clubbing around Montreal. Quimby got that in good form, and he eased us out onto the immensely wide perpendicular tarmac. We were like a minuscule fiddler crab dipping its toe into the ocean. I glanced to the right from my shotgun seat, as one automatically does, and saw powerful headlights lowering in the gray morning fog. The kind of headlights that are on the front of gigantic battleship-sized flying airfoils that go 500 miles per hour and weigh as much as whole herds of dinosaurs. Of course, one is to presume the headlights were from an airliner landing on a parallel runway. There had to be many runways out there, but I decided to go ahead and mention it. My exact words were, "I hope that guy is not landing here." I figured Quimby would make whatever use of that remark that his current level of pilot licensing might require. He was not one of those cocky flyboy aces who was going to show the world how the world should be. He was basically just another guy, like me. He paused. We were out in the open right-of-way by 10 to 20 feet, but there were still many yards of width out there. We waited. A wise choice. A fish-tailing 727 roared down ahead of and over our position and bounced and slid on the icy runway into the foggy distance. Our icy runway. In all fairness, even if we'd been out there in the middle doing our final check, the monster would have come down over us and further down the runway. We would have only been clobbered if we had rolled forward and launched up into his belly. I suppose the exhaust wash might have blown us away. But then we weren't out there, were we? I looked at Quimby, not remonstratively, more just for general support and sharing. He reconfirmed with the tower without making any side remarks, and we headed out into the middle. He did the checks in a rather hurried way, I thought, and we headed down the runway. I think he was making the same calculation I was with the speed of the checks. Those big boy landings are separated by a good 2, 3, 4 minutes. If we get out there and up and veer off before the next one zooms in, we might be okay. That's what I mean by aplomb. It was my intention in this story to simply mention 2 or 3 small incidents before getting on to the big aplomb story. But as you can see, these airline stories lend themselves to low-key, clearly recalled ancillary detail. You don't hear the bullet that kills you, but you recall all kinds of minutiae which accompany the one whistling past your ear. For instance, there was a lot of drama for me when I crawled down the aisle of a sleep-darkened Tokyo-bound 747 back in the day and stole, maybe I should say confiscated, a tower of Gaulois cigarette packs from the armrest of a dozing fellow traveler. I had noticed that every time he woke up, he lit up a new blue death cloud, and I wasn't going to take it for another 13 hours. When he woke again, he angrily requested a replacement stack from the steward, and they were replaced with Chesterfields, which milder emissions I was able to tolerate with 13 hours of righteous aplomb. I can still recall almost every slinking leopard-like advance down and back on that carpet-covered aisle as the rows of passengers dozed in the surrounding seats. That reminds me of an example of airplane non-aplomb. When my golf buddy Bob noticed after the third bounce that our sputtering four-prop backup Lockheed Constellation from Jacksonville to Charlotte was having trouble getting airborne. He had just plucked, with permission, a slab of fried fish from his seatmate's brown paper bag, and so was feeling pretty sanguine about things, I think. And in a bored but loud voice that carried throughout the cabin, which was already into a stilted, stiff-necked silence after a particularly pathetic bounce and attempted speed increase down the tarmac, he intoned, "I don't think so." That riveting statement, particularly in plain view of the line of scrub oaks close at hand ahead blocking the entrance to the sky, led to considerably more neck-clenching and white-knuckling on the armrests. This would be an example, at first glance, of a lessening of aplomb. But we did still make it into the air and on to Charlotte, didn't we? That was really Bob's way of saying it was going to be okay. And it was. I'll just mention the 5,000-foot diving double flameout in a 767 due to a lightning strike over the Caribbean one night. In all fairness, a decidedly unpanicked captain voice did come on ex post to explain, reluctantly, I thought, that we had been hit by lightning, but that the plane was designed to withstand that, no problem. He might as well have said the airframe actually thrived on said impacts, was indeed fabricated to solicit them, as far as how much we believed him. There were, after all, 300 people on that flight with shattered psyches. He had to say something, but it did show genuine aplomb, at least on his part. There was the case of the old Mohawk de Havilland Twin Otter 19-seater bouncing up and down a couple of hundred urgent feet vertically one frigid night in the black sky above upstate New York. It was in the days when the back several rows were set up so you could sit facing your fellow passengers. There was a big guy sitting opposite me who I had seen back at LaGuardia taking down a cheeseburger and fries with a big Coke before takeoff. He'd had another Coke en route before the heavy turbulence. He was strong, but no one is that strong. The plane was rising and falling like the world's most efficient, pulsing pneumatic elevator. I dove into the aisle just as he lost it and began clawing my way forward. I heard the splatter on the wall behind where I had been sitting, like the Irish Sea smashing against a Scottish cliff. But it was really no use. Like laughter, that smell spreads quickly in close visceral quarters. There were soon 19 seats of short-fused, convulsive, barfing and squalling, as if a cougar had just jumped in through the window of a pig barn. Yet the gate arrival, down the frozen metal stairs into the frigid night, drenched as we all were, was orderly and filled with aplomb. There was a dignity there that was empowered and soaked through by sheer human decency and perseverance. There was, of course, a heavy gastric smell penetrating the night, but the aplomb was also strong. As I say, not all airplane stories are infused by the proximity of fireball death, but most are, and it's the details that are closely remembered. I had friends who had to exit by slide from a 707 back in the 60s on a remote gravel runway in France because of a forced landing bomb threat. They had to walk barefoot through field stubble and never got their luggage back. And there was no water or bathroom facilities in the abandoned war vintage hangar where they spent a day and a half. The events were potentially horrible, and yet the story was studied, humdrum, not to say actually hilarious, every time they told it. Maybe surviving to tell the story is the very definition of aplomb. That plane was later disassembled and taken out by truck. Maybe that's another kind of aplomb. But on to Santa Barbara, where, for me, airplane aplomb was born. I was there on business, light business suit, briefcase. Again, a 19-seater for the short flight to LAX. There were only 4 of us traveling, no stewardess, the 2 pilots. I was strapped in on the left, facing forward in the line of single seats. There was a heavy-set, thick-necked guy a couple seats in front of me, and a lady and gentleman, not together, across the aisle. The thick-necked guy reminded me of the Frisbee bowler hat throwing bad guy in Goldfinger, and he looked the part. Tight, dark suit, the kind of guy who would laugh at pain or fear, though, as it turned out, events ahead proved otherwise. He was clutching a sturdy attaché case in his lap. No doubt it contained something extremely valuable. I had latched mine, containing practically nothing, into the overhead. The separated pair was on the right, a lady forward, and a business guy like me a few rows back. There didn't seem to be enough weight on that side for balance in the fuselage, given the big thick-necked guy on my side. But maybe the extra seats on that side made up the difference. I didn't see any reason to point that out. The lady was lovely, as usual, though wearing a bit too much perfume. Admittedly, it was of some kind of intoxicating tropical flower, possibly mimosa. Again, the details. The guy was a standard edition corporate type, much like myself, although my tenure in that line of work was already starting to wane. My game was financial hedging strategies. His was probably selling securities containing hidden risk, so we probably offset. As we eased up from the beachside strip into the azure sky, I glanced at the little town lapping up against the verdant slope and thought, gee, I could live around here. I ought to think about that. Only later did I discover that even a hovel on that hillside went for $4 million a square foot even back in the day. And there's a city ordinance that restricts non-grandfathered plumbing to an outdoor non-chemical compost system that smells like a dead moose and a coating of goose crap in a black fermenting vertical tunnel shaft of wet smoldering darkness. Some of these details might be a little imagined. Now, I had heard that there were some sort of 100-mile-per-hour Sirocco winds inland, the kind, I presumed, which in the off-cited Raymond Chandler first line would cause, quote, meek little wives to feel the edges of their kitchen knives and study their husbands' necks. I hadn't experienced anything along those lines that day, but then it didn't seem very windy down along the coast in town. Nonetheless, I had somehow internalized the Scirocco phenomenon because I knew what it was when it hit us. It happened just as we crossed a certain delineated altitude above the pristine bay. The props had been buzzing gently like summer bees on a sunflower. The Scirocco, coming over the crest of the coast range, slammed us and tossed us like a fluttering toy being thrown to a pet cheetah. We were blasted upward and flipped, then dropped. The previous light pedestrian blue sky was switched out for the dark purplish pelagic expanse of the Pacific Ocean that used to be below. Upside down, we fell like the proverbial rock. I do not recall the increasingly loud cartoon buzz-bombing pre-collision diving Doppler sound of the props that you might expect. I do recall the repeated savage banging of the cockpit door back and forth against the metal side cabinets where they stored the various flotation devices and food service. I felt that we had stopped going forward entirely. Everything was now down. As we dropped, I got quickly beyond the certainty that we were going to hit the ocean below. That seemed almost past tense already. There was no time for fear or sadness, no life passing before me, no regret. It was a bright sunny day. There was going to be a big metallic bang when we hit, and that would be it. I think I went all zen up there during those few gravitational thousands of feet per second. There was going to be no pain, I knew that, just the metal bang. A few feet above the waves, somehow the pilot either righted the plane or the plane righted itself. Maybe that's what airfoils do, unbalanced or not. There was a reasonable sort of whooping thump, and we seemed to hang there like a yo-yo. The light blue sky had returned to its proper position above the dark purple ocean sky, now much closer, but back below. We were proceeding south toward LAX, much lower and seemingly much slower. We had to have fallen 7/8 of our height. I could see cars on nearby Highway 1, close enough to make out some makes and see some driver and passenger profiles. As I glanced back forward, I locked eyes with the co-pilot through the open cockpit door as he unpeeled himself from the front windscreen glass and crawled back over the instruments into his seat. Last time he'd be sitting there unbuckled, I thought. When he was well ensconced, he reached around and pulled the cockpit door shut so that my view was blocked. I was never able to see the pilot at all from my angle. I glanced around to discover that my three companions had all fainted. Why I didn't, I do not know. I can only think I had a great reservoir of contentedness with life at that time, which was not available to my fellow citizens who were still struggling with life's little hopes and dreams. I was either far past all that, or yet to embark on that ride. Or I just had what we can call aplomb. The thick-necked guy's head was slumped straight forward and showed some glistening sweat above his freshly starched collar. I think he had somehow maintained his attaché case grip. I could see its polished metal hinges sticking out into the aisle. he was out. The woman and business guy across the way seemed a little more splayed and sunk down in their belts than before, and I thought they might conceivably have both been dead, though their belts held them like rag dolls in their more or less previous positions. The plane proceeded on its coastal course and did not try to climb back up toward where we had hit the wind. There were no words from the cockpit at any time. Maybe they were spoken, but the communication wires had snapped and the pilots assumed that we were satisfied with whatever words they had passed along, assuming that we had heard them. I don't think so, though. I think they just drove on. The woman was the first to snap out of it. She unclicked her belt and moved around as if checking to see if her body still worked. She turned and looked at me and squinted like maybe what had happened was somehow my fault. I raised my palms up and rolled my eyes upward. I thought it was a generous gesture, but she seemed disgusted and a little angry and was in no mood to make light of it. The thick-necked guy was next. I heard him groan a bit, and he raised his palms to his face as if he was rubbing his eyes with his fingers. Maybe he thought it was a particularly forceful dream. He was probably glad to feel that his attaché case was still in place. I still today think there was something quite valuable in there. The other business guy was heard to be stirring, but I decided not to look at him. I didn't want to form any kind of a bond. We were not going to be friends. The rather odd thing about that particular trip down from Santa Barbara was the way it ended up. The pilots missed the landing at LAX. Hard to believe. Our gnat-like prop in the middle of the wide black braking tire marks on that immense desert of a runway. They could have landed perpendicular to traffic on that thing and had plenty of space. It was not possible to miss that landing. But maybe there was something amiss from the angular motion of the flip-over, drop, and flip back. Maybe they only noticed it as they started to touch down and had to go around. Maybe they were just too shattered to do even the most ordinary things in life anymore. It took about as long as the whole trip up till then to do the big circle back through all the air traffic and land again. And that was it. The cockpit door did not open as we deplaned. The exit door was open from the outside. There was no "thanks for flying Pacific Small Routes" or whatever airline it was. Maybe they needed to file some paperwork up there in the cockpit. Maybe they were spending a little extra time on the wording. Maybe they didn't file anything at all. Maybe they were just sitting there. I headed on for my connection for the red-eye to New York, which turned out to be a totally level flight without a single bump. That flight, too, ordinary as it was weighed down with intense airplane aplomb.